Thank you, and I'm certainly not going to start by giving you my CV. But hopefully some of the stories I'll tell will cover some of the episodes of change that I've been through in my life. And I am known as a bit of a change agent. And I guess it started quite early in life when I got fascinated by all things new. And I can remember when we got our first television at home and watching Star Trek in the early 70s. And I wasn't necessarily that big into sci-fi, but I was fascinated by the way they did things and they communicated with each other. And I still sometimes today, when I make a phone call on my Apple Watch, I'm truly amazed how far we've come. And in those days when I was a little girl, I could only imagine about the exciting future that I was going to end up living through. And this sort of desire for change and this desire for new things has always been with me. It's never left me. But it hasn't always been great for me. I remember in the 80s, I worked for a very traditional company. It's probably a bit more modern now. I'm sure they would not like to be thought of as being old-fashioned now. The Prudential, big life assurance company now. It did all sorts of types of insurance back in the 80s, and it was a fairly formidable employer and formidable company. Well, I was going for a new job. I was going for promotion. And I had my interview and I thought that went really well. And then they did a personality test on me. And this was one of those tests with this little spider diagram. So, it comes up with all of these points and it draws a sort of web, a spider's web about where you rank on each aspect. And I was pretty good on most of them and I went round quite, balanced. And then one, I went out like this. And that was my need for change. Now, needless to say, I didn't get that job because I think it was far too worrying for them to take on somebody with such a desire for change in their life. And sometimes I remember it being so bad that I would come back from a 2-week holiday from work. And if nothing had changed in that 2 weeks, I would start to get serious depression because I wanted things to be different all the time. Now, I'm lucky now. I live in the centre of London and I don't have a heavy commute or didn't have a heavy commute to work. But years ago I did. And again, my need for change was so bad that every single night I would have to set my alarm at a different time for the following morning. And I would never be able to take the same train to work. So I couldn't bear this sort of routine. And even in my 8 to 10 minute walk from home to the Lloyd's building, I used to vary it. So sometimes it would take 8 minutes and sometimes it would take 10. I'm just one of those people that loves to have change in my life. Now, at one time, I was pretty lucky because I worked at GE, General Electric. Now, GE might not be going through such a great time at the moment, and it's got all sorts of pressures to break itself up. But when I was working for GE, it was an acquisition machine. And so we had change going on all the time. And GE was also embedding Six Sigma methodology. And it was really trying to get this idea of continuous improvement embedded in its entire culture. Now, because I loved change, I went to my first Six Sigma training course and I thought, this is fabulous. This is all about getting perfection, getting every single non-value added step in a process out. And I got fixated by it and I wanted to do all my qualifications and get on, and I wanted to become a professional black belt. Now, it didn't actually happen because we made lots of acquisitions, and every time we made an acquisition, I then got another big job. So I never actually managed to sort of tear away from insurance. And I've stayed in insurance for 37 years. So in a way, that's complete contradiction to my need for change. However, I've been very lucky that I've had lots of opportunities in my life. And after GE, I worked for a small Swiss company, and we made lots of change happen there, but then it was sold, and I ended up at the Zurich Group. Now, the Zurich Group was very interesting. Having worked at GE, where it was about continuous improvement and they were never satisfied with anything, I arrived at this very old, large organisation that hadn't really changed much. And each acquisition it had made, it hadn't tried to integrate. So it basically was 275 individual companies all around the world doing their own thing. But there was a very inspirational CEO, Jim Shiro, at the time, and he hired me to lead a program called the Zurich Way. And the Zurich Way was their global transformation program, which of course was right up my street, and I was very excited about it. And what we did was basically try and engage as many people as we could around the world to do things the same way and take out cost and all the rest. So it was a bit like a GE Six Sigma program, but done the Zurich way. And it was fascinating because it had actually launched when I arrived. And I went around to talk to lots of people, and I realized that the reason they were fundamentally doing it was because there'd been targets set for delivering on cost savings, and people's bonuses were being impacted by it. And the more I dug into it and the more I went around the world, I realized that there was very little actual buy-in from the people. And it had become almost like a lot of other things we have going on at work. People just do it because that's what they get paid for and it becomes their job. And I realized that it had lost its excitement and it wasn't engaging people. And if there's one thing I've learned about change is, of course, engaging people is the most important thing. So we realised actually that we had to close that transformation programme at Zurich because almost down to the fact that people were just delivering numbers in such a mundane way that we then started to realise there was a sort of malaise going on. So we actually had to call a stop to that, and that can be a very challenging thing as well when you're trying to drive a lot of change and you've got to call something to an end. But it was the right thing at that time. But then if I come forward a bit, and I was approached to run Lloyd's of London, this was another complex transformation. Something that I had never taken on before because it's a market and not a company. And before I get into this challenge, and this is the one I'm going to focus on mainly, about some of the learnings I've had in the last 5 years, I'm just going to take you back to 1688. 1688, just across the river from where we are, there was a street called Tower Street. It's called Great Tower Street now, but it was very important in 1688 because it led down to the Thames, where the Port of London Authority was, and all of the ships used to come up the river and offload all of their goods. You know, it was a real merchant's paradise. This is where it was all happening. And Tower Street was full of coffee houses. Merchants were actually running their businesses out of their homes. It was vibrant. And one of the coffee houses used to like to differentiate themselves from each other. So they wanted to get a specific topic that they were the experts on. And Edward Lloyd was running one of these coffee houses, and he decided to specialise in marine or maritime, in the maritime sector. So he got known to be the place where you went for your shipping news. So if you were a ship owner or you were a merchant and you were importing goods or transporting goods around the world, this is where you went to get the up-to-date shipping news. But then, of course, the sea was very treacherous in those days, so you might lose your ship and your valuable cargo. So they started one of the original sort of crowdfunding ideas. They decided to club together and put money in, and then whoever's ship was lost at sea, they would be able to take the money out. And that was the formation of Lloyd's of London back in 1688, where they sort of started underwriting each other's business. And it was done where the voyage would be written out on a sort of piece of parchment paper. And if anyone in this group wanted to participate in this risk, they would get some of the premium that was paid for by the ship owner, and they would say, well, I'll take 5% of the risk. And they'd write their name and they'd write 5%. And so they would underwrite this risk, and it would get syndicated amongst them all. Well, in 2013, when I was approached to go to London, it's now a $40 billion business, $40 billion of business traded every year in exactly the same way. Exactly the same way. The brokers would walk around with slip cases, as they were called, because this piece of paper that outlined the risk was called a slip. And they would carry them with bound in big leather cases, and they would walk around and they'd sit next to an underwriter in Lloyd's, and they'd look at this slip, and the underwriter would decide if they wanted to participate on it, and he'd get a wet ink stamp, and he'd stamp his syndicate name, and he'd sign it in ink and say how much of a percentage he was going to take of that risk. After 325 years, unchanged. So I took on the challenge of moving this market where you've got there were about 90 different syndicates all trading and about 200 odd brokers coming in. So about 8,000 people mingling together in a physical environment just over the other side of the river. Every day trading business like that. I took on the challenge of moving that from paper to digital. And without a big bang, by the way, because I was not allowed, as the stock exchange had done many, many years earlier, in the 80s, I was not allowed to close it and say, all of you go off to your offices and trade digitally. We had to keep the room, the sacred room, open, with everybody able to meet every day. So this was the challenge I took on. And it was particularly challenging and a little bit threatening because many of my predecessors had failed and billions of pounds had been spent on it and no one had managed to achieve it. And if you go through the archives of news, you've got all sorts of Financial Times articles on how the iPad's going to transform Lloyd's, and it never did. So this was an enormous challenge. And I thought, well, how am I going to do this? Because actually I didn't really know. But the first thing I did was I just listened and listened and listened and listened and realized that we had to do things very differently in terms of no longer it hadn't worked up till then, but we could not force this enormous change through on the market. There was no way we could wield a big stick. So first thing I had to do was go to my board and say, do you know what? We're going to consult with these 34,000 people and we're going to get them to build their future. Now just think how my board responded to that. Inga, we brought you in here to modernize this place. What do you mean you need all of this time? I said, I need this time. Because there was such cynicism had built up over these decades. There was hardly a person in that entire marketplace who believed, A, that we should do it, but B, that we could actually do it. So I decided the only way was to bring people in and consult and consult and consult. Now, I did manage to persuade the board to be patient with me. I said, look, I will need to do this consultation and this will be hours and hours and days and weeks and months. But it's so important. And of course, what happened was we got people to design their own future. And while we started off very slowly, and in this day and age, and particularly when we talk about agile and needing to move at pace and get everything done quickly, you might think this is absolutely not possible to do a major transformation with such a slow start. But I tell you, it paid off. Because we had to win over hearts and minds like we had never done before. The wall of resistance to change was so vast It was the only way that we could see it was possible. So we had consultation groups, and we did it in very different ways as well. So it would have been, might have been, there was lots of digital consultation, there were workshops, there were senior leaders, so I engaged with the CEOs. We did every level, every function in all of these companies to get their feedback. And that's how we did it. And of course, slow start meant actually, once we'd hit that sort of time where the light bulb went on and people understood what we were doing, we got all the support, and then it went much quicker than we'd planned. So although it was a slow start, when it actually started in motor, it was much quicker. Now, we did use a lovely big consulting firm, not necessarily the one we're sitting in right now, but one of the big consulting firms. And of course, the other thing, and they were very good because they helped us gather all the data and start building the vision. And after about 10 months, we did have this wonderful vision with a wonderful blueprint. But what were we going to do with this? It was so complicated and so over-engineered, there was no way we were going to be able to communicate people to get them excited about this vision. So and I put a board together of CEOs in the market. The first meeting I said, you know what, we're going to have to simplify this. So the other thing that I had to persuade my board to do was not do the 16 things in this whole transformation program, but to do 4. And everyone's going, you can't just do 4. I said, we're doing 4. That was a really, really tough decision because there are some people with real vested interests for certain functions, and they say, well, I want to be first. My area should be the first one. And we had to make some really tough decisions to say, I'm sorry, we're parking 12 of those things and we only focus on the 4. But what that enabled us to do was to deliver on time and in budget quickly, because we focused fully on a much, much simplified plan. So that was another very, very important thing, was simplify what you're trying to do without dumbing it down. And this is nothing to do with thinking that people can't understand complexity. It's not to do with that. It's if you're trying to move thousands of people, and I'm sure some of you are involved in transformation that involves thousands of people, you have to keep the message simple enough so that it gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and people can be your advocates for change. Because if there's another thing I learned, was I thought I was a broken record. I thought I kept saying what was happening, and then I would end up in a conversation with somebody who said, oh, what's this? What's this transformation? And to me, I couldn't believe that they hadn't heard about it. But they hadn't, because the communication you have to be relentless at, and you have to pick out your advocates for change. And one of the things I learned, so you've got the people who are out there being your absolute star supporters. And if you think of them as sort of all riding on a tandem bike together, they're the people cycling at the front. They're the green bikers, they're the green ones, and they're pedaling like fury, and they're all excited, and they're driving your change program. And then in the middle, you've got all the yellow bikers who are, they're cruising, they're pedaling along with you, but they're not with the green ones. They haven't quite bought it, but they're with you. They're not putting the brakes on like the people at the back, the red bikers. Now, I decided to leave the red bikers out of it. I decided it was just not worth trying to bring them with us. The group we had to work on were the yellow bikers. And every time we found somebody who had a glimpse of green in them, so they were a yellow biker, but we saw that they were excited about something, we snapped them up and we got them involved. And we got them involved in being our advocates. And they were speaking the same language as people. So we also got them to go out and talk, and in all sorts of communication ways, whether it was live sessions, whether it was videos, podcasts, you name it, it didn't matter what it was. We used every conceivable way of communicating to this population. But one thing we wanted them to do was to not go out and do a pitch perfect presentation and tell everyone how wonderful this tool was and that thing was and that thing, because none of it was perfect. None of it was. but we got everybody to go out and talk absolutely openly and honestly about what was going on and how there were some failings in what we delivered, but how with everyone's input we were going to iterate and iterate and make it better. So that was a huge learning about engaging all of those wonderful advocates for us. The other thing we did a lot of was to engage more and more of the senior people. So when we started, I realised in the 4 work streams, just the 4, I was getting my own people within the Lloyd's corporation, so people who were directly reporting to me. I got them to be the champions because there were so many cynics in the market. I couldn't get any of them to be the champion leader, so I had to get my own people. But then I realised we needed to get the CEOs, we needed to get the business leaders themselves to put their hand up and own it. And as soon as we delivered on one of the modules, and it had been proven to be successful, I had then all the CEOs saying, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll do this. And that was wonderful because then they were seen as serious. They were CEOs of businesses. I mean, some of these businesses are £3 billion businesses, so they're not small. And as soon as people in the market saw that they were the real believers, they started to follow. And we had this amazing transformation happen. Now, another thing we did, and I think about the Big Bang approach again, is how we approached one of the areas which was about the actual removal of the ink stamp. Now, these are your frontline people. This is their life you're affecting. They've been doing this, some of them have been doing that for 30 years odd. This is their life you're really affecting. So we did it very, very, very gradually. And we decided to go for a group that were fairly small, and we actually chose terrorism insurance. So you might go, wow, yeah, what's that? But Lloyd's writes terrorism insurance, but because it's a very, very niche product and it's a very small group of underwriters and brokers that do it, we decided to pilot it there first. Well, it wasn't really a pilot, we might have called it a pilot, but it was the real thing, but that was where we started. So we did that, we made it work there, then we got another product, then another product, and another product, and another product, and another product, and another product. And we did it like that, again, because we just realised we had to sort of do it like an evolution. We couldn't have this absolute big bang approach. Well, the technology is exactly the same, but we just did it group by group. And we used all of them to tell the message to everybody, to say, well, it's working now, and this is it, and you can do it. Now, some of the toughest groups became, once they're won over, of course, your biggest fans and your biggest advocates. So it is great once you've won over people like the people who are the mariners who wrote marine insurance, because I don't know how it happens, because certainly none of them are 325 years old, but for some reason that was the first product that Lloyd's ever wrote, and you found that the people working in that area tended to be the most old-fashioned and the ones that clung most to their history. So that was very important. Now, one of the surprises I had when I was talking to the market and the people was about the age demographic. And I think earlier on somebody was talking about age and trying to perhaps get some of the more traditional people to come on board your change can be much more difficult. But the young generation are out there and they're really going to grab this. Well, I can tell you that is not what we found. I assumed it was going to be what we'd find. But we talked to these young people, and they were some of the most fearful people in the market. They just joined, and they were fearful for their jobs. They said, but you're destroying our jobs. If you're introducing technology, our jobs won't be here. So we didn't get the response we expected from the younger generation. And what we did with that group in particular was we got them to work on a piece of very related work that we hadn't actually thought about as being part of this big transformation, but that was designing the jobs for the future. Because we realised that the fear that they were feeling was real, and I don't know whether you know much about the what goes on in your brain when you're fearful, but you actually have a chemical reaction that closes down the center part of your thinking brain. You lose your creativity as well. So when you're bringing people through change, you have to be very mindful that when they're fearful, they're going to be their least creative. They're usually fleeing and wanting, to cut themselves off and somehow not be out there, coming forward positive with creativity. So we wanted to get them excited, and we gave them the task of designing the jobs of the future based on what the vision was going to be like, what the new jobs were going to be like, using technology. And then, importantly, designing programs for upskilling and reskilling people. Because we knew that we needed to bring in a whole host of new digitally savvy people, but we couldn't lose all of this workforce as well. We had to bring them with us. So that was a massive piece of the actual transformation, was designing the jobs of the future with the young generation and then putting in place the training and learning and upskilling that was required for that generation. Big part of what we had to do. Now, a few other things that I learned on the way was when I arrived at Lloyd's, the central corporation of people, which is about 1,000 strong, weren't necessarily used to operating in a very open, creative environment. And I had to actually start changing a lot of the cultural things in the centre of the organisation. Now, for some people, I suppose it's the thing I can describe that corporation, it's most akin to a corporate centre in a big global group, where some of you work in big global groups. Perhaps you're in the corporate centre, or maybe you're in one of the sort of business divisions. But that's the closest it's like. But it's running a whole market. But I realised that the culture was not very open. It was very hierarchical. And I had to break down the hierarchy. So, and when I say break down, it meant we had to break down walls, because I remember I arrived and I think my office was about a similar size to this room, the largest office I'd ever had in my entire career. And it had some windows, but the only windows were looking out on St. Paul's Cathedral. Nobody could see in my office. All the walls were dark, solid, and the door was solid. And I remember a funny thing when I first arrived, and I had my meetings in the calendar all set up with my direct reports. And I had my door open, and the first guy didn't show up, and I thought, well, this is funny. After 10 minutes, I thought, perhaps he's busy. So I went out and looked for him, and I found him, and I said, oh, you ready for our meeting? He said, oh, yes. Yeah, I'll come over. Okay, so we had our meeting, and then the second meeting, and second guy didn't show up to the meeting, and I thought, well, this is odd. So I went out and found him. Anyway, by the time the third meeting occurred, and the third person, actually is Guy, because they were all men at the time, the third guy showed up, and I said, what is going on here? Is this an anti-Inga campaign? I mean, what the hell is this? And they said, no, but your predecessor's door was always closed, and even though the meeting was in the calendar at a certain time, we weren't allowed to come until his PA phoned us to tell us it was okay to come to the meeting. Now, things like that, you might say, well, that's a silly little thing, but actually these are massive cultural challenges that you need to overcome if you're going to really modernise the place you're working. So, of course, I got rid of all the walls. I sat in an open, actually with a standing desk, I stood most of the time in a completely open environment with all the people, and all of my exec team did the same. Some of them weren't so happy, but I think they saw the benefit of it afterwards. But it was all about trying to show that we mean business, we want this to be open, and we want people to talk about things in an open way. So these cultural things can be really tough to do. The other thing was that we were absolutely bogged down with committees. I realised, now I'd been used to very much wanting to be empowered as an individual, wanting the authority to go off and do something. When you're in an organisation that loves committees and they love making decisions on committees, you realise that generally people don't like being empowered. Now, I realised if we were going to make this change happen, we had to start empowering people. So we started eliminating committees, and making people accountable and responsible. Now, you can just imagine what happened there. Half the people hated it. They didn't want it. They'd never had it and they didn't want it. So even though you think as an individual, this is how I like to be treated, you realise that lots of people don't like to be treated like you do. They want to be treated like they want to be treated. So again, you've got to work through these cultural challenges in a very, very thoughtful way. Now, another thing I did was we were now quite into the programme of transformation, but I wanted to feel the pulse of what was going on, because I couldn't understand why people didn't want to change so much, why they were so fixed on this culture. So that's when I started having reverse mentors. And I know a lot of people do that now, and it's getting much more popular. But no one had ever done it in Lloyd's before. But I said, I want to have reverse mentors. And I first of all went out and I said, I want people who are within the first few years of their career here at Lloyd's. And I got actually inundated with requests, because other people say, well, what young 19-year-old, because we have an apprenticeship program as well, so we have not only people who've graduated out of university, but people who come in straight from school. What 19-year-old is going to have the courage to come and speak to the CEO? Well, you'd be surprised. So I had a long line of people who wanted to be my reverse mentor. So I did them in 6-month slots so that I could get through people. And then we also got some of the rest of the executive to do it as well, and to have reverse mentors. Now, that was very helpful for me, because they were telling me, they were the new generation, and they were telling me the things that they didn't like, what was going on. And one of the things, I remember one of these younger people coming in and saying, Inga, he said, I get so bored. He said, I come in, I have to sit in the same desk every day, I'm sitting next to the same people. I said, it's really boring. Why can't I sit in different places? And I said, right, well, we are moving to an agile workplace, but our technology isn't up to date yet, so we can't do it. But then, of course, you have that conversation with that person, then you have a conversation with somebody who surrounds themselves by all their photos and awards and collections, and you look at this and you've got this guy bored because he's sitting next to one of these people every day. And you realise suddenly the complexity of trying to make change happen. So we did a whole piece around revamping the values and the behaviours. Again, including a lot of people, and some people, you need patience when you do this thing. But we engaged lots of people and we came up with our new values. And then we got people to say how much they associated themselves with this and how much we displayed it. And we learnt a lot. And while we were very pioneering on taking on the latest, brightest new product, so cyber security 5 years ago was such a hot insurance topic, and Lloyd's was leading the way in providing the most modern insurance product for cyber. We were way behind in being pioneering in the way that we were working. So you can also have a culture that doesn't inside in the way you work, which doesn't actually match what you're doing on the front, which is very, very interesting, because often people say that your brand has to go all the way through your organisation. But here we had, again, these contradictions where we had absolute state-of-the-art products, but we were doing things in a very, very old-fashioned way. But then that brings me on to another thing about complacency, and I saw complacency was on the board, and you were talking a little bit about complacency. And I've stepped down from full-time executive role. I get to meet people from big organisations, old established organisations, and I get to meet some startups. And I would say there's complacency on both sides of the house. I've spoken to some of the CEOs of some of the big banks, completely complacent, that they've got all this disruption sorted out. Yes, we've got this, this team working here, we've got this garage here, we've invested here in this startup, we've got it sorted. These challenger banks, they're nothing to us. They're not really our competition. There are a lot of complacency still. Then I speak to a startup, one of the challenger banks, they're completely complacent. Oh, they're not our competitors. They're, we don't need to be worried about them. So they've got complacency of another sort. They're so high on what they're doing that they don't think that any of the incumbent players are going to be competitors or anyone to worry about. So it'll be very interesting how all of this pans out, because in my experience, always keep an eye and never think about an eye on what's happening out there, and never ever think that somebody isn't your competitor. So it'll be very interesting, I think, because there's complacency in my mind on both sides. But I also got a bit complacent. And this, I think, can happen when you've got these major programs. And I got complacent twice in the 5 years I was at Lloyd's. And they both, one I think doesn't bite back at me anymore. Another one still does bite back at me every now and then. One of them was, I thought, because we'd made such change and transformation, and we'd got all these green bikers, and we were rah-rahing, and we were delivering, and it was all great, I thought, well, this is easy, this change. So I'll ban alcohol at lunchtime. So the Lloyd's Market's somewhat renowned for a lot of drinking. And I decided I'll just ban alcohol at lunchtime. Of course, it's the right thing to do. We need to revamp our drugs and alcohol policy. So, we discussed it as an executive. It was a no-brainer, isn't it? You can't have people drinking at lunchtime and making billion-pound decisions after a few pints. Well, do you know what? I didn't consult. We just did it. Whoa! Now that got more headlines around the world than anything else I did in 5 years.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the press.
Yeah. I from Australia to Argentina, I mean, you name it, this got picked up in the press. It took me completely by surprise, and that was absolute complacency on my part in not understanding how important, even if you weren't a drinker, I was getting to the very heart of their culture. And and even today, still, it's still talked about. I mean, I can go to a meeting and someone will laugh and joke about the alcohol ban, still, even today. I mean, it's quite incredible. The other thing I did, which was silly after the alcohol thing, I should have learned, but we used to have some Lord Nelson silver in the middle of this trading floor. The Lloyd's building is the oil rig on the other side, and it's got a massive trading floor, massive gallery. But in the middle of it was a display case with some of Lord Nelson's silver. And I thought, well, we've got to modernise this place, so we've got to put in benches for the brokers, charging devices for all their mobiles. I thought we've got to modernise the place. So I thought, well, I'll move this silver down a floor and make a sort of heritage sort of museum thing. And we put a nice graphic all along the walls to show the history of Lloyd's, and it was, I thought it was fantastic. Well, that was another revolution I had to face into, where I had done something that I should never have done, and I moved a case of silver one floor down in the building. And the hate mail, the threats I had that I should go off and die and I didn't deserve the role were quite extraordinary. Now, so twice I was complacent. So if any of you are on major change programs, don't ever become complacent about anything. Because this change that we drive through, and I am a change agent, and I still will continue to want to push for change, but it is so tough because these nerves that you can sometimes hit, you just don't know where they're going to be. And the one thing I've learned is this absolute importance of diversity. Now, if I had one of those old names from Lloyd's, the guy who'd been in Lloyd's for 50 years, he might not be actively working, but he still comes in because it's his sacred market and he likes to look at Lord Nelson Silver. I should have had one of him on the team of that change programme. Just like when I did the archive of Lloyd's history, one of the black guys working for Lloyd's came up to me and he said, "Inga, you don't mention the slave trade on that history." And I said, "No, gosh." Now in Lloyd's, was an important factor in the slave trade. Lloyd's was insuring the ships. So it was an important part of Lloyd's history. But I'd had nobody from African descent or felt a connection to Africa to point out that we needed to have that in our archive of Lloyd's history. So the whole, again, thing, the importance of, however small the change is, putting up a graphic or putting in technology that's going to affect thousands of people's ways of working in their daily life, all of them you need to bring in the diverse thought. The people who don't think like you, who have a different memory, have a different experience, think of something in a different way. It is so important. And I know there have been loads of reports about the most innovative people and the most sustainable businesses are going to be those with diverse teams. Now, but I know for sure, I mean, I've seen it, I've lived it, that it's vitally important. And I know that one of the things I go through is no one person will make a decision about hiring anyone into a team, because you've all got your biases. So every time I really liked someone, I made sure that people who were different to me also interviewed them and made sure that there was something that they liked about them as well. Because it couldn't be just one person's choice. Otherwise, I would end up with what I had in the 90s, which was the Spice Girls, because I'd hired 4 women who looked, well, perhaps not looked like me, but were like me. They were women. And the brokers would come in and joke about visiting the Spice Girls. And that was before I understood about how important it is to be diverse and inclusive. And I fell into the same trap myself as hiring people just like me. But I really honestly have learnt the hard way in this that you must engage with as many people as you can from as many different experiences and backgrounds, so that they will make sure that whatever's designed for the future is going to be fit for the future and inclusive for everybody. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to that. I am now very happy to take questions and have a conversation about anything I've spoken about or anything else that you might want to talk about more broadly. Thank you very much for listening.